The Webster's house was like most of the others in the neighborhood, detached, modest, and surrounded by neat little gardens. It was the sort of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. I'd babysat for them plenty of times before, enough to know where the biscuits were kept and how to work the remote for their stubborn telly. Tom and Beth, the kids, were easy to manage. Tom, 8, liked to read himself to sleep, and Beth, 6, usually conked out after a story. By 8:30, they were tucked in, the house quiet, except for the occasional creak of the central heating. I was settled in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone when I thought I'd better do my usual round upstairs. The Websters liked to know I'd checked on the kids at least once before they came home, though neither of them was prone to wandering in the night. Upstairs was silent, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. Tom's room was on the right. His door was open a crack, just as I'd left it. He was sprawled across his bed, the book he'd been reading still open on his chest. I gently pulled the duvet up over him and left the room, heading for Beth's on the other side of the landing. Her door was closed, which was strange. I had left it ajar when I came downstairs. I opened it cautiously, feeling that flicker of something that made me hesitate before stepping in. The bed was empty. The duvet was tossed back, and her favorite stuffed rabbit, the one she never slept without, was on the floor by the window. The window was open. I froze, staring at the curtains swaying in the faint breeze. My heart started pounding as I crossed the room. Below the window, in the flower bed outside, were small, muddy prints, the edges smudged but unmistakable. They led away from the house, disappearing into the darkened garden beyond. My hands were shaking as I shut the window. Beth wasn't the type to climb out of a window for fun. She was quiet, shy, and easily spooked. Something about the scene in front of me felt out of place, as though it didn't belong to this house. This life. I backed out of the room, not even bothering to pick up the rabbit. I checked the rest of the upstairs rooms, my steps feeling loud against the carpet. The bathroom was empty. The Websters' bedroom was untouched, the bed neatly made. I went back to Tom's room and stood in the doorway staring at him. He was still there, still fast asleep, but I couldn't bring myself to feel any relief. Downstairs, the back door was locked, just as I'd left it, the front door too. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, gripping the counter, trying to think. The garden was pitch black, the streetlights from the road barely reaching the back fence. I grabbed the torch from the utility drawer and stepped out into the cool night air. The footprints were clearer in the mud than they had been from upstairs. Small, barefoot, the kind that could belong to a child. They led across the garden, past the swing set and toward the hedge at the back. The torchlight wavered as I followed them, feeling the damp grass soak through my trainers. The hedge separated the Webster's garden from the field beyond. It was dense enough to stop a grown person, but a child could squeeze through without much effort. The footprints disappeared at the hedge line. I crouched, shining the light across the damp ground on the other side, but there was nothing to see, just the empty expanse of the field stretching into darkness. The garden felt too quiet. The wind in the trees above me seemed to swallow the usual night sounds. I stepped back toward the house, scanning the windows, half expecting to see Beth standing there looking down at me with that little frown she always wore when something confused her. But the windows were blank, the curtains still swaying in a room upstairs. Back inside, the house seemed to press in around me. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the pipes felt louder, sharper. I went back to Beth's room, picking up the stuffed rabbit and clutching it against my chest. Her bed looked untouched, like she'd simply disappeared into the air. I checked the time. Nearly 11. The Websters would be home soon. I tried to think about how I'd explain this. What words could I possibly use? I went downstairs, pacing the length of the living room, keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of the house. I checked the locks again, my hands trembling as I tested the bolts. Then I heard something upstairs. It wasn't loud. A creak, maybe, or the faint rustle of fabric. I froze, staring at the staircase, the torch gripped so tightly my fingers ached. The light bounced against the walls as I took one step, then another, the carpet soft beneath my feet. Tom's door was open wider than before. I stepped inside, the beam of the torch sweeping across the room. His bed was empty now, the duvet crumpled on the floor. The book he'd been reading was gone too, the bedside lamp tilted slightly as though knocked. I backed out of the room, the rabbit slipping from my hands onto the carpet. The sound came again, this time from the landing. I spun around, the torchlight shaking as I scanned the empty hallway. The house felt colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your skin. I stepped toward Beth's room, the door still ajar. Inside, the window was open again. The curtains billowed slightly in the breeze, and the footprints were back, smaller and fainter this time, but leading toward the bed. There was something under it, something that moved. Babysitting had always been an easy way to make some extra money. That night at the Webbers' house was no exception. The kids, Daisy and Max, were well-behaved, polite in the way that made you think their parents might actually enforce bedtime rules. Daisy was 8, Max 6, and by 9 o'clock they were both tucked away upstairs, their bedroom doors cracked open just enough for me to hear them if they called out. The house was a semi-detached on a quiet street, not too big, not too small. Mrs. Webber had mentioned they were renovating the kitchen, so there were bits of plaster dust in the corners and a faint smell of fresh paint in the hallway. It felt lived in, normal, the sort of place where nothing strange ever happened. I was in the living room when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. It was just after 10 and the Webbers hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. My phone was on the coffee table, so I grabbed it as I stood, the screen lighting up with the time. I paused for a moment before heading to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the doorstep. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe older. His jacket was a bit too big, the shoulders hanging loose. His hair was messy, dark strands plastered against his forehead like he'd been out in the wind. He wasn't smiling, just standing there, his hands in his pockets, staring straight ahead. I stayed behind the door, gripping my phone a little tighter. He knocked again, his hand moving in an oddly stiff way, like he wasn't used to the motion. After a pause, he leaned toward the door and said something about being the kids' uncle sent by the Webbers to collect them. He even mentioned their names, Daisy and Max, as if that would make it all seem normal. I didn't open the door. My finger hovered over the call button on my phone. I checked the messages from Mrs. Webber, the ones from earlier in the night. Nothing about an uncle or an early pickup. Nothing at all. I went to the living room window, careful to keep myself out of sight. The curtains were drawn, but there was a gap where they didn't quite meet. I could see him standing there still, one hand now resting against the doorframe. He wasn't moving, not even shifting his stance, just standing. Something about it made my throat feel tight. I stepped back from the window, my socks silent against the floor. Upstairs, the house was so quiet I could hear the faint creak of the radiator pipes cooling. I checked the front door again. Through the peephole, his face looked closer somehow, though I hadn't heard him move. His expression hadn't changed. The lock felt solid under my hand as I made sure it was engaged. Then I went to the kitchen to double-check the back door. It was locked too, the latch secure. The garden was dark, a messy sprawl of flower beds and weeds illuminated by the motion-activated light above the shed. I stared out for a moment, almost expecting to see him there, but it was empty. When I returned to the living room, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was Mrs. Webber. Relief flooded through me as I opened the message, but it was only a note apologizing for running late. No mention of anyone coming to pick up the kids. I decided to check on Daisy and Max. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound sharp in the stillness. Daisy's room was nearest. She was asleep, her face turned toward the wall, one hand clutching the edge of her blanket. I moved to Max's room. He was sprawled across his bed, one leg dangling off the side, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of deep sleep. I stood there for a moment, watching the rise and fall, listening to the soft rustle of the duvet as he shifted. Then I heard something else, the faint scrape of movement downstairs. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the landing. The front door was locked. I knew it was. I'd checked it twice, but there was a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the living room. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A soft shuffle, like fabric against wood. I backed into Max's room and closed the door as quietly as I could. My heart felt like it was hammering against my ribs as I went to the window. The garden below was empty. The shed light flickered once and went out. I stayed by the window for what felt like an eternity, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. The silence was worse than the noise, stretching out until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Then, From the hallway outside the bedroom, I heard the floorboards creak. I froze. My phone buzzed again. I glanced down at it, the screen lighting up with another message from Mrs. Weber. Before I could read it, the door handle to Max's room moved. It didn't open, but it shifted slightly, the faintest scrape of metal on metal. I moved to Max's bed and crouched beside it, pulling him closer to me. His breath was warm against my arm as he stirred, but didn't wake. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, every muscle in my body tense. The handle moved again, and then it stopped. It was an ordinary night until the wind started picking up. I'd been babysitting for the Haydens for a few months, always an easy gig. Their house was one of those newer builds on the edge of town where the roads are too wide and the trees are too young to offer any real shelter. The baby, Mia, had gone down around 7 without a fuss, leaving me with a few hours of Netflix and scrolling on my phone before the Haydens were due back. Around 9, the wind had become fierce, the kind that rattles the window frames and whistles through the cracks, setting your nerves on edge without you realizing. Rain lashed against the glass, and I'd been half watching some show when everything went dark. Not the dim kind of dark where the TV glows or the hallway light leaks in. This was pitch black, the house swallowing every trace of light. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the power to kick back on. It didn't. My phone was on the coffee table, so I fumbled for it, using the screen's glow to navigate to the kitchen. The Haydens had mentioned candles in a drawer somewhere, and I started pulling them open, one after the other, my fingers searching through utensils and batteries and mismatched bits of rubbish. The storm was still roaring outside, the rain hitting the house with a force that felt almost alive. I finally found a candle and matches, lighting it with shaking hands. The flickering flame cast a dim circle around me, making the shadows jump in a way that made my chest tighten. I grabbed a torch from the same drawer and switched it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Mia's room was upstairs, and I decided to check on her before doing anything else. The stairs creaked under my feet, each step sounding too loud against the storm's chaos. Her door was open just a crack, enough for me to see her cot by the torchlight. She was sound asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. As I turned to leave, something caught my attention. A faint movement near the window. I froze, my torchlight bouncing off the glass. For a second I thought it was the tree outside, its branches shaking in the wind. But the shape was too still, too deliberate. It was gone before I could focus properly. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the rain-soaked pane. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the storm and the light. Still, I pulled the curtains shut, not wanting to see the outside anymore. Back downstairs, I lit another candle and placed it on the coffee table, trying to convince myself the worst was over. The torchlight swept across the room as I moved, landing on the large sliding glass doors that led to the garden. The curtains there were still open, and I could see the faint outline of the patio furniture being battered by the storm. Then I saw it again. Just the edge of something, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. It moved out of view so quickly that my mind scrambled to piece together what it was. A shadow? A person? The torchlight caught nothing but the reflection of the empty room behind me. I locked the doors. The bolt clicked into place with a sound that somehow made the house feel even quieter, the storm a dull roar in the background. My hands felt clammy as I gripped the torch tighter, scanning every corner of the room. The baby monitor on the counter crackled faintly, white noise filling the air. Another sound made me spin around. It wasn't loud, just a faint scrape like something brushing against the exterior wall. I shone the torch toward the sound, but the beam only revealed the stark emptiness of the kitchen. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped closer to the window over the sink, angling the torch's light toward the garden again. Nothing. I backed away, feeling the urge to check on Mia again. I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could, avoiding the spots that groaned under pressure. Her room was exactly as I'd left it. The curtains were still drawn, and she was still asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something outside wasn't right. The noise came again, sharper this time, followed by a muffled thud. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't the wind, it came from the back of the house. I went to the landing and shone the torch down the staircase. The faint glow of the candle flickered below, but everything else was swallowed by shadows. I hesitated, gripping the torch like a weapon as I descended. The back doors were still locked, the curtains now pulled shut. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling me. The screen flashed with a notification, the Haydens saying they'd be late. I didn't respond. I couldn't take my eyes off the back doors. Another sound. this time from upstairs. A creak, as though a footstep had pressed down on the wood. My stomach dropped, my legs rooted to the spot. The baby monitor hissed softly on the counter. I grabbed it, listening for any change. I heard something faint, a sound too soft to place, like fabric shifting or breathing too close to the microphone. The torchlight trembled as I aimed it up the staircase. I climbed the stairs again, holding my breath, the sound from the monitor growing quieter the closer I got. Mia's door was open wider now, just enough for me to see the edge of her cot. The curtains were no longer closed. One swayed gently, caught on a draft I couldn't feel, and Mia was gone. It was an ordinary Saturday night. I was at the Thompsons' house, babysitting their 2 kids, Ellie and Ben. The house was a boxy 2-story affair on the edge of a quiet suburb, the kind of place where the nearest neighbour's porch light seemed miles away. It was all routine, cartoons on the television, snacks in the kitchen, and the faint scent of lavender from Mrs. Thompson's potpourri bowl on the coffee table. Ellie, 6 years old, had fallen asleep on the couch, her face buried in a pillow. Ben, 4, was curled up under a fleece blanket, his small hand clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Outside, the wind rattled the bare tree branches against the windows. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just firm. 3 quick raps. I froze for a moment, listening. The Thompsons hadn't mentioned expecting anyone, and it was almost 11. I set my phone down and walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, his figure half illuminated by the glow of the porch light. He wore a dark jacket zipped up to his chin and had his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I stayed where I was, not saying anything. He knocked again. Then, in a voice muffled by the door, he said something about needing help with his car. I didn't reply. I just stood there, my heart tapping a little faster than before. The man shifted his weight and leaned closer, squinting at the door as if he could sense me on the other side. He said he needed to use the phone. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a flatness that didn't match the words. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away, my socks silent against the hardwood floor. I went to the kitchen, grabbed my mobile, and called the Thompsons. No answer. I tried Mr. Thompson's mobile, voicemail. I stood there for a minute, holding my phone like it was a lifeline. Then the knock came again. Harder this time, but not frantic. 3 knocks, spaced out, deliberate. I felt the tiny hairs on my arms rise. Ellie stirred on the couch, letting out a soft murmur, but she didn't wake up. I returned to the door, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the chain lock. Through the peephole, the man was still there. He hadn't moved much, except his head was tilted slightly now, like he was trying to hear something inside. His breath puffed out in faint clouds under the porch light. I stepped away, went back to the living room and turned on the TV. Just noise, I told myself. White noise to drown out everything. I kept the volume low, not wanting to wake the kids. Minutes passed. I checked the peephole again. He wasn't on the porch anymore. Relief began to creep in, and I almost convinced myself it was over. Then I noticed something, a dark shape in the garden. He was standing on the grass now, halfway to the window. My breath caught. I ducked back, keeping low beneath the sill. He didn't come closer, at least not then. He just stood there, as if sizing up the house. I crawled back to the living room, grabbed Ellie and Ben, and led them upstairs. They didn't protest. They were too drowsy to know something was wrong. I locked the bedroom door, ushered them into the closet, and sat with them, listening. For a while there was nothing. Then I heard the back door handle rattle. I didn't know how he'd gotten around without making a sound on the gravel path. The kids clung to me in the darkness of the closet, Ellie starting to cry softly, muffled against my shoulder. The rattle stopped, then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the outside of the house. He was circling, testing every door, every window. I could almost imagine him trying to find a weak spot, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered inside. I clutched the phone but didn't dial. I didn't know why. Maybe I was afraid the noise would give us away, or maybe I didn't want to risk moving, not even to speak into the receiver. The steps stopped again. Silence filled the house. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than any sound outside. Then a sharp crack. The living room window. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I held the kids tighter, whispering for them to stay quiet. The sound of glass shifting, the faint creak of footsteps on the floorboards. He was inside. We stayed in the closet, the three of us packed together, barely daring to breathe. Footsteps crept up the stairs. They paused outside the bedroom door, and I could hear the faintest sound of fingers brushing against the wood. The handle turned, but the lock held. Then the sound stopped altogether. We stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting for the door to burst open, for his face to appear, but nothing happened. When I finally worked up the courage to open the closet door, the house was empty. The front door stood ajar, swinging lightly in the wind. There was no sign of him, no car parked on the street. Nothing but the shattered glass and faint scuffs on the floorboards to prove he'd ever been there at all.